Welcome to Infidelity Diaries. Explore the secrets and stories of infidelity with us. When I saw Nate's message, it felt as if everything inside me froze. The words on the screen were straightforward. Left with friends for a couple of days. Don't miss me. No explanations, no warnings, not even a hint that this trip with friends was in his plans at all. The message was so sudden that for a few seconds, I couldn't even understand what I was feeling. Hurt and anger quickly replaced the confusion, leaving a hollow emptiness in their wake. All week, Nate had been acting distant, leaving for work earlier than usual, coming home later. I reasoned it was because of some new projects, seeing his effort as a sign of care for our future. After all, we're family. He's always been restrained in showing emotion, but I like to think that beneath that mask was a quiet, sincere care. And now, it felt as if he didn't exist. Our home suddenly felt empty. I stood by the kitchen counter, still staring at the screen. The phone seemed like a stranger, relaying something unpleasant but explaining nothing. On the counter, the morning coffee cups still sat. Crumbs from breakfast we ate in silence scattered around. I feel like I'm becoming unbearable even to myself, I thought fleetingly, but I brushed it aside. Number that would be too simple. The problem wasn't that. The problem was that I could no longer see in him the man I once loved. Not knowing what to do with myself or with this dreadful feeling eating me up inside, I picked up the phone and called a taxi. Emily, my best friend, and the only one who knew everything about Nate and me, was the person I could trust with even my most tangled thoughts. Her faith in me and her ability to listen were my only solace. She met me at the door, instantly noticing the tension in my movements. I tried to mask it with a weak smile, but she merely shrugged and pulled me into the living room, not allowing me to make excuses or hide behind explanations. "What happened?" she asked as I sank into her soft couch, leaning back and closing my eyes. "He left without saying a word. Just sent a message saying he went on a trip with friends. You get it? Nate, my husband, didn't think it was necessary to even warn me, as if I have no right to know where he is." "You deserve better than that, Jessica," Emily said softly. "But how do you feel, besides the anger?" I paused, trying to find words that could capture this burning, oppressive feeling inside. "I don't know how to explain it, Em, but it feels like he's been gone for a long time. We just live under the same roof like strangers. I can't even remember the last time we really talked, you know?" My words came out louder than I'd intended, but I didn't care. I couldn't hold it in anymore. Emily nodded, a look of understanding in her eyes, as if she, too, had faced something similar. "Jessica," she began after a pause, "sometimes relationships go through phases where you feel like strangers. It's normal, but it's essential to remember there's a way out. Do you know what you want?" "I want. I don't want to feel like a stranger in my own marriage," I said. "I want him to be here again, like before, for us to feel each other, for there to be warmth. But it's not just a lack of attention. It's as if I don't matter to him anymore." We sat in silence as I tried to gather my thoughts. Emily, as always, patiently waited, not rushing to comfort me with banal reassurances. She knew how to listen, even when there were no answers. "And what will you do now?" she finally asked. "I don't know. Maybe I'll just wait it out. Try to understand what I really want." We hugged goodbye, and I headed home. The evening street was dark, a cold wind cutting through, almost mirroring my own thoughts. The house greeted me with a silence that now felt even heavier, and the longer I stayed alone, the more that silence pressed in on me. I tried to find solace in the routine, but the very idea of routine felt unbearable that night. On autopilot, I walked over to the window, looking at the light across the street. In the window of the neighboring house, I saw a silhouette. It was Lucas, the new neighbor with whom I'd exchanged a few words outside. He stood there, slightly tilting his head, peering into the darkness, as if he, too, were searching for answers to unspoken questions. There was something oddly symbolic about it, as though we were bound by a shared, silent secret. I found myself lingering, something about him sparking an interest, something that made me ponder. A little later, I stepped away from the window, but thoughts of Lucas lingered, weaving themselves into my reflections about my own life. The next morning, I decided to leave earlier, even though I had nowhere to rush to. Nate still hadn't texted or called, as if the distance between us had become his new normal. Hurt and irritation slowly but surely turned into exhaustion, bringing along with it a strange sense of apathy toward everything related to him. On my way to work, I planned to stop by the shopping mall near my house, buy something for the office, distract myself, and keep my mind from wandering back to him. Stepping out of the store with a small bag, I was about to cross the street when I noticed the gray clouds thickening over the city. Thunder rumbled loudly, and the first raindrops made me instinctively reach for an umbrella, which of course I didn't have. "Jessica?" A voice called my name with a hint of surprise. I turned around and saw Lucas. He stood by his car, parked near the entrance of the mall, looking at me with a slight smile. "Hi," I replied, struggling to hold back a relieved smile. "Looks like someone wasn't ready for the rain." He nodded at my empty pocket, where the umbrella should have been. "Yeah," I laughed, "just like all my morning plans." "Need a ride? The rain's only going to get worse," he offered, nodding toward his car. His gaze was relaxed and genuine, and I agreed without much hesitation. We got into his car, and I felt a bit awkward in that small enclosed space, especially as the rain intensified, muffling all outside sounds. The cabin smelled lightly of freshness and something distinctly masculine, a little cool, much like Lucas himself. "Do you often drive in this direction?" he started, tilting his head slightly toward me. His voice was calm and assured, but beneath that calmness, there was an odd inner strength. "Actually, yes. My office is nearby. And you?" "Recently, I've had some business nearby," he replied, with a subtle hint of mystery. A pause hung between us, and I caught his gaze, holding it just a bit longer than I should have. His eyes seemed to be saying something important, something he didn't want to say out loud. In that moment, I suddenly felt the exhaustion and despair of the past few days fade into the background, and something awakened within me, something I hadn't felt in a long time. My heart started to beat faster, and I realized we were teetering on a dangerous edge. "You look tired," he finally said after a moment, hesitating. His voice was soft, almost caring, and I couldn't help but reply. "Maybe I am," I mumbled, trying to appear calm, though my voice trembled slightly. Lucas glanced at me for a moment, then returned his eyes to the road. There was something warm and comforting in his silence, requiring no explanations, an unspoken support that somehow made things feel lighter. I looked away, trying to compose myself, but then I suddenly felt his hand gently brush against mine. It was like a spark. I could almost hear my quickened breath, and his touch, light, cautious, seemed to stir something deeply hidden within me. I turned to him, expecting to see surprise or embarrassment in his eyes, but there was none. He looked at me with genuine sincerity, as if trying to understand what I was feeling. It all happened so quickly. I didn't have time to realize what was happening before his lips gently touched mine, and my heart pounded harder than ever. His kiss was unexpected, yet at the same time, natural, as if we'd both been leading up to this moment, unaware. A moment later, I pulled back, trying to gather myself. Everything I felt in that second was both terrifying and thrilling. I looked at him, unsure of what to say. On one hand, I understood it was reckless, but somewhere deep inside, I didn't feel a profound sense of guilt. Nate no longer took me seriously, and lately, I'd felt like a ghost in our marriage. Lucas simply looked at me, saying nothing, but in his gaze, I saw something I hadn't found in Nate for a long time. His confidence and calm reassured me, as if to say, It's okay. There's no need to explain or justify yourself. We drove the rest of the way to the office in silence, unsure of how to end the conversation that had begun and how to respond to what had happened. I lowered my eyes, clutching my bag tightly, feeling my pulse racing. Lucas, I thought, wanted to say something but didn't. When the car stopped, he simply nodded. See you? Thank you for the ride, I mumbled as I stepped out of the car, feeling his gaze on me. The day passed in a blur. Memories of the kiss, his gaze, his silent support flashed through my mind, and I couldn't concentrate on work. I kept trying to justify myself, finding all possible reasons not to feel guilty. Nate had stopped caring about me, our marriage, and sometimes it seemed his constant indifference was a form of betrayal, to which I responded with the same distance. But as soon as I closed my eyes, Lucas's image resurfaced in my thoughts. When Nate returned and unexpectedly suggested going out to dinner together, I was a bit surprised. This wasn't part of his usual routine, and the last time he proposed something like this felt like months ago. Nevertheless, I agreed. Perhaps a small hope still lingered within me, hoping that something between us might change, that he was willing to listen, to understand, that we might be able to feel each other again. The restaurant was quiet and cozy, and for the first few moments, I felt a sort of calm. We ordered food, and I expected he'd start the conversation, maybe ask how I was doing, or at least show some interest. But Nate seemed tense, and every movement he made, glancing at his phone or sipping his wine, only thickened the silence between us. How are you? I finally asked carefully, trying not to seem too insistent. He looked up and nodded, giving a short response. Fine. Work, as usual. Work, I thought, trying to hide my disappointment. It was as if he was hiding everything he ought to say behind that single word. It felt like there was nothing in his life but work, and I hadn't been a part of it for so long. I smiled, though inside I was tense. Jess, I know you'd like us to spend more time together, he suddenly said, looking directly into my eyes. But right now, with these projects, I just can't relax, you understand? All the time I have is taken up by this. His voice was calm, almost businesslike, and though I heard his explanations, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was a detachment hidden behind his words. Nate, I understand you're busy, but it's not just about time. I paused, feeling my words drifting into emptiness. I just want there to be something more between us than just a house and responsibilities. He looked at me with surprise, as if hearing for the first time that I wasn't satisfied. You mean, like, romance? His tone held a skepticism that hurt me. Not just romance, I answered, feeling disappointment well up inside me. I need you to be here, Nate. Not like a roommate who comes home in the evening and leaves in the morning, but like someone I can share my thoughts, my feelings with. Just talk. He simply looked away, silent and focused. It seemed that my words hadn't touched him, hadn't made him feel for even a moment that he could lose me. The dinner ended in heavy silence. We ate quietly, each bite seemingly a confirmation of the distance between us, a reminder that we were on opposite shores. I couldn't shake the feeling of alienation, as if every word, every attempt to connect was only a faint echo, fading in his indifference. After dinner, I told Nate I wanted to take a walk and get some air, and he didn't even ask where I was going. He just nodded, shrugged, and walked toward the car, as if this was just another evening, not a moment when something in our marriage was fracturing. I walked toward the park, trying to gather my thoughts. The sky was gray and cloudy, and a faint breeze cooled my face, brushing away my troubled thoughts. In the silence and solitude, I felt calmer, as if all the tension between Nate and me had stayed back at the restaurant. Jessica? A voice suddenly called out from the darkness, and I flinched. Turning, I saw Lucas walking toward me, his hands in his pockets. He stopped, smiling slightly, though there was something sad in his gaze. Hi, Lucas, I replied, feeling the tension in my body replaced by a strange calm. I didn't expect to see you. Neither did I. He looked at me closely, and there was understanding in his eyes. Out for a walk? Just needed some fresh air, I smirked, trying to hide my embarrassment. He nodded, and we walked side by side, saying nothing unnecessary. There was something elusive but comprehensible between us, as if we both knew what the other felt. Finally, he broke the silence. You know, sometimes loneliness just hits, and even surrounded by people, you feel completely alone. I looked at him, sensing that his words were no coincidence. There was something in his tone that told me he knew this feeling all too well. Do you feel lonely, Lucas? I asked softly, unsure if I wanted to hear the answer, but still hoping he'd say something. He held my gaze for a moment, then slowly nodded. After breaking up with my ex, I tried for a long time to find something that could fill that void. But, loneliness isn't just about having someone around. It's deeper, especially when you realize you can't be yourself, even with the ones who are supposed to be there. His words were simple, yet they sent a shiver through me. My soul responded to his confession, and I realized that our encounters weren't just random. I understood that my feelings for him had grown more complex, and it wasn't merely a friendly fondness. In him, I saw a reflection of my own struggles, and with each new encounter, this sense grew stronger. We fell silent, but I understood that this silence said more than any words could. Emily decided to throw a birthday party, gathering all her friends at her place. She was one of those people who could create a festive atmosphere, and her gatherings always attracted a diverse crowd. When she invited me and mentioned I could bring Nate, I thought it might be a chance to unwind a bit, to try and spend the evening like a normal couple. Maybe this could help us find a way back to who we used to be. We arrived a bit early, but the house was already filled with guests. Familiar faces, lively voices, cheerful laughter. It all seemed so natural, as if none of us had any cares or worries. I tried to get into the conversations, to push my thoughts away. Nate immediately found his colleagues and, immersed in some work-related discussion, seemed to forget about me entirely. I stood nearby, exchanging polite smiles with his acquaintances, feeling like just another part of his environment, not someone significant to him. After a while, I noticed Lucas. He was standing by the window, talking to one of Emily's friends, but his gaze occasionally swept across the room until it stopped on me. In that moment, our eyes met, and something inside me stirred. His presence made everything else fade, as though he was the only one who truly saw me. We both continued to act as if it was merely an exchange of glances, but the tension between us grew with each passing moment. A bit later, Emily approached me with a glass of wine and smiled, watching me closely. "How are you, Jess?" she asked, her voice soft, but with a hint of concern in her eyes. "I'm fine," I lied, taking a sip of wine and trying to smile. But I could tell my smile didn't mask the turmoil within. "You seem different today," she observed. "It feels like something's on your mind." "Nothing really, Em. Just, I guess I'm a bit tired," I replied, though I knew her perceptive gaze had already figured it out. At one point, the music turned louder, and guests began to dance. I pretended to be swept up by the atmosphere and joined the dancers, wanting to forget everything, even if just for a few minutes. I let the music carry me, closed my eyes, and tried to focus only on the rhythm. But the moment I opened my eyes, I saw Lucas walking toward me. He approached me with a slight smile that held something deeper, and, placing his hand on my waist, invited me to dance. My heart raced, and I nodded, trying to stay calm. We danced to the slow rhythm, and with each of his touches, something strange, uncontainable, grew within me, as if everything I tried to hide became exposed and vulnerable. At one point, he leaned close to my ear and whispered softly, "I think about you, Jessica." Those words struck my heart. His voice was quiet, barely audible over the music, but it was the most personal, most significant moment of the evening. It was as though he'd expressed without words what I felt, but was afraid to admit. A tremor of mixed emotions and doubts washed over me. I tried to conceal my feelings, but I knew that our glances, our touches, everything exposed us completely. I felt him gently squeeze my hand, and I realized that this evening had changed everything. There was no longer the randomness that could justify our encounters. We couldn't keep pretending it was just curiosity or innocent interest. This was going much further. I lifted my head and saw that Nate was watching us. His gaze was piercing, guarded, and in it, I saw something new. Suspicion. In that look, I understood that he had noticed our tension, our closeness, and it made me break contact with Lucas and step back a few paces. Nate walked over to me, his face calm, but I could feel the inner storm. He stopped close, as if trying to pull me away from Lucas, and quietly asked, "Jess, you seem distant. What's going on?" I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. His words, spoken so simply, touched on all the hidden feelings I'd been trying to keep down. "Nothing much, Nate," I answered, avoiding his gaze. "I noticed you've been keeping to yourself more tonight, and it seems our new neighbor isn't indifferent to you," he said, his words unexpectedly sharp but with no anger, just a bitter, painful tone. "Nate, you're misunderstanding," I managed to say, trying to avoid a direct answer, but I knew he could sense the lie in my voice. We looked at each other as if we were strangers, and I realized there was an insurmountable wall between us. That night, I understood that our silence and unspoken words had become a barrier that would likely never disappear. The next day, when Nate mentioned he was leaving for the weekend to help his uncle at the cottage, I tried to appear indifferent. I nodded subtly, as if his absence didn't bother me at all. He barely looked me in the eyes as he packed his bag, almost as if he knew this had become his usual way of avoiding me. The evenings that used to be filled with conversations and shared activities had turned into endless loneliness. I couldn't understand what drove him to distance himself so far. Our life together had become something like a staged performance, where each of us played a role. He, the busy man engrossed in work and his own affairs, and I, left in the shadows. But this time, I felt something different. A strange sense of release, as if this emptiness, his absence, was exactly what I needed right now. I decided to spend the day doing things around the house, but with each passing minute, it became harder to ignore thoughts of Lucas. We hadn't spoken since meeting at Emily's party. Our glances and touches still lingered in my memory, stirring emotions I tried to resist, but unsuccessfully. I was drawn to him, a strange but irresistible pull, unlike anything I'd ever felt before. In an attempt to distract myself, I headed to the bathroom to freshen up. The pleasant warmth of the water washed away the tension, but thoughts of Lucas grew clearer. I closed my eyes and pictured him, his piercing gaze that seemed to see right through me, his voice, filled with understanding. It was a feeling I had been missing. These thoughts unsettled me, and I tried to return to my routine, convincing myself that it was all just a figment of my imagination. The creak of the door pulled me out of my immersed state. I opened my eyes and turned around, just in time to catch a glimpse of a figure standing at the doorway in the mirror's reflection. My heart began to pound wildly, and I instinctively covered myself, feeling utterly vulnerable. It was Lucas. He stood at the bathroom door, his gaze fixed on me, piercing. For a moment, I felt shock and embarrassment, but I didn't say a word. He simply stood there, silently watching me. In his eyes, I saw not only admiration, but something much deeper, something I was afraid to acknowledge myself. It seemed he, too, couldn't look away, as if he were spellbound. "Jessica," he murmured softly, though his voice seemed to be lost in the gentle sound of the water. My initial shock turned to a thrill, and instead of pushing him away, I did something I hadn't expected of myself. I nodded, letting him know his presence didn't unsettle me. He took a hesitant step inside, carefully closing the door behind him, but his movements showed no hesitation. My heart felt like it might burst out of my chest as he came closer. Finally, I felt alive, in the moment, without doubts or fears. His lips met mine, and I surrendered completely to the rush of it. Everything I had held back, everything I had hidden deep within, poured out. Those moments passed in a blur, leaving a faint taste of something forbidden, yet endlessly desired, lingering in my soul. The next day, Lucas suggested meeting up. He didn't ask directly, didn't make any presumptions, but only whispered quietly, as if he was afraid to hear a refusal. Let's go somewhere, just the two of us. Not for anything special, just for us. His words were so simple and sincere that I couldn't refuse. My heart filled with anticipation, as if it was our first date, rather than something forbidden and secret. We arranged to meet in the evening at a small pier by a lake near the city. Wearing a light dress, I headed there with anticipation. The evening felt detached from reality, and I knew that tonight we could finally stop hiding, stop playing hide and seek with our lives, and simply be ourselves. When I arrived at the pier, Lucas was already waiting for me. He had a basket, a blanket, and he looked relaxed, as if he had been waiting only for me. We both smiled silently, as if words weren't even necessary, and he gestured for me to join him in the small boat. Once on board, we drifted away from the shore. Lucas handled the oars with ease, and I just watched him, marveling at his calm. His movements radiated confidence and peace, as if we weren't on a lake, but in the quiet slumber of the city. Finally, we reached a spot where there was no sound of cars, no hustle and bustle. Only gentle waves touched the boat's edge, and silence enveloped us like a silk veil. Lucas spread out the blanket and invited me to sit beside him. We settled at the bottom of the boat, under the open sky, surrounded by the calm, almost mirror-like water. In the basket were simple treats: fruit, wine glasses, a bottle of champagne. Everything seemed thought out, yet not overly romantic or pretentious. It was a true atmosphere of closeness and warmth, without frills or theatrical gestures. Do you often set up dates like this? I asked with a slight smile, feeling the subtle excitement mixing with nervousness. He smiled back quietly, reclining on the blanket. Honestly? Never. This is the first time. He looked into my eyes, and I saw something vulnerable, something genuine. I just wanted to show you a place where we could forget everything. Do you think I need to forget? I looked at him seriously, feeling that this question was more about us than the present moment. No, not forget, but maybe feel something new, something that makes you happy, Jessica. He said my name slowly, and I felt those words resonate within me. We sat, gazing at the shimmering reflection of the moon on the water. Surprisingly, I didn't feel a bit of guilt. This place, this moment, felt real, something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. Lucas looked at me with a tenderness that touched me deeply, and I wanted to know him more, to understand what had led him here, to this deep vulnerability. Lucas, I began cautiously, breaking the brief silence. It seems like you're hiding something, something you don't let anyone see. Why? He sighed softly, reaching for a glass of wine, as if gathering courage. His gaze fell on the smooth surface of the water, and he replied, "Probably because I've long been used to hiding my past." He paused, looking into the distance. There was a time I thought that if I pushed everything away, I'd start fresh. But you know, that doesn't work. You can't just leave behind the part of you that caused you pain. And if you could leave it all in the past? I asked, feeling that I genuinely wanted to understand what he was keeping within. Lucas looked at me with sadness, a shadow of something bitter flickering in his eyes. If I could, I probably wouldn't be here with you. He sighed and added, Jessica, each of us carries our own pain. And that pain is a part of us. But in you, I've found something that makes it quiet, you know? His words touched me deeply, and I realized that he, like me, was searching for something real, something alive. In that moment, I felt as if there were no secrets between us, that we were equally open with each other, and that feeling gave me an incredible sense of peace. We continued to talk about everything and nothing, sharing our thoughts and dreams. Each moment of that conversation was filled with a sense of closeness that felt impossible to find elsewhere. Lucas spoke of places he'd been, of people who had influenced him, and I realized that he was someone who had long been searching for his path, but hadn't yet found it. When our conversations about life reached their end, we sat in silence, looking at the night sky. The stars shimmered above us, and I felt like they were closer than ever. Lucas leaned toward me, his hand grazing my cheek, and he quietly said, "Jessica, I've never felt this calm with anyone." I just smiled in response, feeling my heart fill with warmth. In that silence, in those brief words, there was something I had been seeking for so long, a simple but deep feeling of closeness, safety, and acceptance. When the night was nearly over, he gently returned the boat to the pier. We came back to the shore, but as I stepped onto solid ground, I knew that this evening, this moment, would forever be a part of me. We didn't exchange farewell words. He simply walked me to my door, touched my hands, and softly said, "Thank you for this evening." And I replied, feeling that in this "thank you," there was everything we could say to each other. It happened in the evening. I came home after meeting with Lucas, still savoring the warm aftertaste of our conversation. A smile lingered on my face, and even after closing the door, I was still mentally with him, replaying moments of our time together. How often had Nate and I been able to talk so openly? How long had it been since I'd felt free beside him? But as I crossed the threshold, I immediately sensed something was wrong. Nate sat at the table, his face tense and pale. My phone lay beside him. My heart stopped. I realized he had found what he wasn't supposed to see. "Jessica." His voice was unusually quiet and cold, stripped of the distant tone I had grown accustomed to. Instead, his tone was full of pain and barely restrained anger. "Do you want to explain what this is?" I swallowed nervously, unsure of what to say. Everything I had prepared as an excuse felt absurd and hollow. Now, under his piercing gaze, any word felt like a way to deceive myself. "Nate, it's not what you think," I began, trying to find the words, but I knew they wouldn't change anything. Everything I might say sounded like an excuse. "Not what I think?" His voice rose, now carrying a distinct note of betrayal. "I see the messages where you confess your feelings to him, Jessica. How could you? You're my wife." He paced the room as I stood there, feeling a wave of shame and regret rise inside me. I was silent, unable to explain this complex, ambiguous feeling that had grown between Lucas and me. "Why, Jess?" he finally asked, turning to me. His gaze was full of pain, and it tore me apart. We've been together all this time. What went wrong?" I stepped forward, trying to meet his gaze. "Nate, I tried to talk to you. I wanted us to be together, not just physically, but emotionally. I wanted to feel connected, but every time I tried, you pulled away. It was like you closed a door, and I didn't know how to open it again." He shook his head, his face filled with bitter disappointment. "Are you saying this is my fault? That I'm the reason you found someone else?" "No. No, I'm not saying it's your fault, Nate." I tried to keep my composure, feeling a wave of trembling overtaking me. "But you have to understand that loneliness can destroy a relationship. For a long time, I felt alone, even when I was right beside you." We looked at each other, and I saw his expression change from anger to despair to pain. To him, this was betrayal. To me, it was a moment of revelation, an admission of something I'd been afraid to recognize within myself. "Do you love him?" he finally asked, and his question cut right through me. Silence hung in the air. I couldn't lie, but I couldn't tell the truth either. It was a truth that was impossible to avoid. I don't know, I whispered. But with him, I feel alive, like I can be myself again. And what about me? His voice trembled. I tried to be everything for you. I worked, tried to provide for us, and you. You found comfort in someone else. Do you know what that feels like? Do you know how much it hurts me? I couldn't respond. I felt his pain, and every reproach felt like a slap. My mind raced, wondering if maybe I had been too demanding. If maybe everything I'd done was a mistake. I never thought it would come to this, Nate, I said, barely holding back tears. But maybe we both became strangers to each other a long time ago. He looked at me for a long time, and I saw the warmth drain from his eyes, leaving only bitterness. He pressed his lips together, as if he wanted to say something more, but couldn't find the words. I felt that everything we had was crumbling in that moment, and that the divide was now impossible to stop. I can't stay here, Jessica, he finally said, quietly, barely above a whisper. I need to leave. With those words, he turned and walked out of the house, leaving me alone with the silence and the emptiness he left behind. After Nate left, an almost palpable silence enveloped the house. I sat in the living room, trying to process what had happened and figure out where to go from here. Everything felt surreal, like I had just come through a whirlwind, and now the silence pressed down with its weight, pulling me into the deepest recesses of my feelings. I realized that everything that had connected me to Nate had crumbled like a house of cards. It was frightening, but at the same time, liberating. I knew I had to talk to Lucas to finally understand what my feelings for him truly meant. I dialed his number, and he answered right away, as if he had been waiting for the call. His voice was quiet but firm. Jessica? He said. Are you all right? I need to talk to you, Lucas, I said, and he immediately suggested meeting at a small cafe we both knew. It was a place with an intimate atmosphere, dim lighting, and soft music, creating a sense of coziness and peace. It felt like exactly what I needed at that moment. When I arrived, he was already waiting for me at a table by the window. His gaze was filled with concern and anticipation, but when he saw me, he offered a gentle smile, as if to say he was ready to listen to everything I wanted to share. I sat down across from him, and our eyes met, open, with no attempt to hide anything. In that moment, I felt he was the only one who could truly understand me, without words. We sat in silence for a few minutes as I gathered my thoughts, and finally, I spoke. Nate found out everything. He found our messages. We talked, and he left. Lucas looked at me intently, his gaze filled with understanding, yet I could see the weight of responsibility he felt for what had happened. He didn't interrupt, allowing me the space to pour everything out. I don't know what happens now. Everything feels so complicated, tangled, I continued, looking out the window at the dark evening city. But one thing I do know, with you, I feel something I haven't felt in so long. I paused, gathering the courage to say what was on my mind. Lucas, you've become more to me than just a friend or neighbor. I feel for you something I once thought impossible. He placed his hand over mine, and in that gesture was more support than I could have imagined. His eyes were full of warmth, and suddenly I felt we were closer than ever before. Jessica, he said softly, I understand that everything that happened between us hasn't been easy, and I understand the pain it's caused. But you should know, I haven't felt anything like this in a long time either. He paused, looking into my eyes. You're not just a passing fancy to me. You're the person with whom I can truly be myself. And if you're ready, I'd like for us to try this together. His words resonated deeply within me, filling the emptiness Nate had left behind. I realized that with Lucas, there was something more than just physical attraction or an escape from loneliness. It was real, something significant, something I had been searching for all along. Yes, Lucas, I replied, feeling a lightness in my heart. I want to try, but I'm scared. Everything feels so uncertain. He gently squeezed my hand, as if to reassure me. All I need is to be with you, Jessica. We can take it slow, step by step, and if something doesn't feel right, we can always talk about it. But the most important thing is, I'm ready to go through this with you. It doesn't matter how long it takes. We talked for hours about our fears, our hopes, and our doubts. I shared with him what I had been feeling, my losses, and how difficult it had been to deal with the loneliness in my marriage. Lucas listened attentively, without interrupting, and in his eyes, I saw an understanding that didn't require explanations. He, too, shared his experiences, talking about past relationships that had left marks on his soul. Our stories intertwined, and I realized he was someone who knew what it was like when a heart longs for a place of its own, and a soul yearns for understanding. That evening, I felt an extraordinary sense of lightness, as though our connection had become genuine, free of secrets and concealed emotions. We were both burdened by the past, but in that place, in that moment, I felt ready to start something new, even without knowing where it would lead. At the end of the evening, as we stepped out of the cafe, Lucas turned to me and quietly said, Jessica, I don't know what lies ahead, but I'm ready to face any challenges if you're by my side. I nodded, understanding that this moment was the beginning of something new for me, something that promised freedom and the chance to be myself. When Lucas and I began our life together, I thought I'd finally found what I had been searching for so long. It was easy and simple for us when we hid away from everyone, when it was just the two of us, cut off from the world. But now that our relationship has become reality, difficulties have started to surface that I hadn't even considered before. A life started from the fragments of the past turned out to be not as simple as it initially seemed. In the beginning, everything was genuinely easy. Lucas and I were immersed in the early days together, making breakfast, watching the sunrise, and sharing dreams as if nothing existed beyond us. In those moments, it felt like our bond was unbreakable, strong, and honest. But after a few weeks, I began to notice that the initial passion and sense of novelty no longer filled my entire world. Each day, I noticed more sides of Lucas I hadn't seen before. He started revealing parts of himself that had been hidden deep inside, vulnerability he hadn't shown previously. Sometimes it appeared in brief moments of silent solitude, as if he was pulling away from me, lost in thought. He could sit on the balcony for hours, staring out the window, and I sensed that in those moments, he was somewhere far away, not right there beside me. One evening, when I suggested a walk in the park, he looked at me with a kind of hesitation and said, Jessica, let's stay home. I just want to be here. Though his words were soft, they left me with a strange feeling of distance. In recent weeks, I'd been noticing more often that he avoided interactions with others, that he wasn't as active and full of energy as he had been at the start. And although I tried to understand where it was coming from, it felt like he was slowly withdrawing. Lucas, are you okay? I asked carefully, sitting down beside him. I'm sorry, he replied softly, his eyes downcast. Sometimes I feel lost, like I'm trying to forget something important. Everything I went through before stays with me, and it's hard for me to let go of it. I listened silently, not knowing what to say. The vulnerability in his voice was palpable, and it stirred conflicting feelings inside me. I knew he was struggling, but at the same time, I felt like I couldn't give him the support he was looking for. Our conversations gradually became less frequent and shorter, as if each of us was starting to hide behind invisible walls. Lucas, who once seemed so confident and determined, was becoming more distant. Now, I could see not only his appealing qualities, but also the inner pain he was trying to conceal. One evening, during dinner, I decided to try and get some clarity. Lucas, I put down my fork, searching for the right words. You know you can talk to me about anything that bothers you. He looked at me with a slight smile, but the confidence he once had was absent from his eyes. Jess, I'm afraid. I'm afraid that our relationship is only an attempt to escape from the past. You feel it too, don't you? His words hurt, though I knew he was right. What once seemed like a fresh start was now turning into a shadow of past mistakes and unresolved issues. We were together, yet each of us still carried the baggage of past missteps. You know, Lucas, I said, struggling to hold back tears. I thought that with you, I'd find what I was missing. But maybe our relationship was built on a desire to escape reality, not to create something new? Are you saying that I'm just an attempt to forget what happened with Nate? His voice trembled, and in his eyes I saw pain. No, I whispered. You're not just someone who helped me escape. You mean more to me than you can imagine. But maybe we both needed to sort things out within ourselves before starting something new. We sat in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. I realized that our love, which once seemed so strong and vibrant, was now on the brink of a test. These changes, this inner struggle, had become a mirror reflecting our inner conflicts.